Capital, capital, capital. What is capital and why is it so central for so many of us when we are thinking about society and the conditions of possibility for all of the things that we don't like, as well as basically all of the things that we do like? What is capital? What is the circuit of capital? What is surplus value and absolute and relative surplus value, and all of these other questions about wage labor and labor power, and how does all of this relate to time energy? Well, what you're going to get here is an overview of all of that. And so we're very excited to bring to you here now on the public side of the Theory Underground channel and podcast, a lecture session that I did with Anne, my wife, Anne Snellgrove McKerracher. This is the Snellgrove McKerracher Synthesis Seminar for subscribers here at Theory Underground. But this one's going to be public because it is also not just useful, hopefully, to anyone who's looking for a quick overview of capital for normies, or a normie-friendly overview of capital, but also an introduction to the kickoff of the Capital Seminar, which for the time being, you can sign up for just by becoming a standard subscriber at Theory Underground. Become a standard subscriber to the Snellgrove McKerracher Synthesis Seminar. You also get the ongoing Capital Seminar, which means that stick around and you'll learn all 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, as well as critiques from within and without of that entire intellectual endeavor. That's all going to be absolutely essential to theorizing our situation today. So if you want to get involved, look in the description of this podcast or video and click on the Get Involved subscription link, and sign up as soon as possible. Get involved. That's all I wanted to say before turning it over here. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. All right, everybody, welcome to the beginning of something really exciting. And so, there's been a lot of this sort of like, we're beginning, or closing out and beginning over the course of the last few weeks here at Theory Underground, because CMT came to an end, CDT also, which is to say critical media theory and critical doxology and time energy seminars. And what I've been doing with Anne, the Snellgrove McKerracher Synthesis, is really kind of turning into its sociological phase. Now, the sociological phase is not to be separated from the economic or anthropological or critical theory. They're not separable. They're not separable at all. But there are different times when you need to focus and really emphasize a certain approach to the social field. And this is that time for us because we're both teaching sociology. I'm teaching Sociology 101, and is teaching sociological communication. And for both of us in the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about capital, right? And for Anne, that means wage, labor, and capital. That's really what she focused on, was that. And then, of course, also Bourdieu and forms of capital. But what we'll be doing today is Anne will begin with wage, labor, and capital and kind of give you all a crash course on that. I don't know if everyone got a chance to read it. If you did not, that's okay. We're going to be assuming an audience of people who did not do the reading, but go ahead and raise your hand if you did do the reading. Will did. Fantastic. Good job, Will. And so that's that. And then I'm going to do a little bit more of like a Das Kapital Volume 1 expansion pack atop what she does with wage, labor, and capital. The thing I want to say right before I turn it over is that this is the first time that we're doing something after the Deep Dives with Dave session that took place. And in that Deep Dives with Dave session, I went over all of these various research threads that you're going to be getting with me. And, I'm going to give you all a quick refresher. We're talking about the history of class and the development of capitalism and early bourgeois sociology, and then non-Marxist sociology after Marx, but then also worldview Marxism, and then class meets race in the United States, class versus the second sex, the developing world, third world, imperialism, colonialism, the failures of worldview Marxism, how the U.S. won hegemony, the medium inverts base superstructure, the rise of the professional managerial class, how institutions construct us. That'd be like a lot of Foucault, that'd be a lot of Goffman, etc. Then the fall of the professional managerial class, right? We're talking about the falling PMC. Professionals becoming increasingly precarious at the same time that standards in the professions are being lowered. And then also the way that PMC social change, though it had its moment in the 20th century, has become a caricature of itself that ultimately undermines any possible positive change. And then the idea of PMC social change and the critique of that kind of social change. And I talked about how we'd be drawing off of philosophers like Levinas and Nietzsche and Bourdieu, etc., to do that kind of critique. And then ultimately getting into the post-class fractured mass and duopoly, where we find ourselves here today. And then I had a bunch of different topics with asterisks, because those ones are kind of themes that I'll be going back to all throughout that intro to sociology that I'm doing for my students. And then, of course, in the deep dive side, we'll be going much, much further than I'm able to with them. And so there is this possibility that you are doing these seminars with us and you're not doing those intro lectures that I have made available to you all. And that's okay. And you'll still get a lot from it because you're all busy and whatnot. But also, it's bingeable content. It's on demand. You can just listen to the playlist. The lectures are only an hour and 15 minutes each. And they are for freshman students at a university, which means, for instance, when Swole asked me if Liz, if this would be like, if this lecture on capital, would it be accessible to Liz? I was like, I think so. I hope so. I think that, Liz would not have to have studied wage, labor, and capital to get the point. But I'll put a big question mark over that when it comes to these sessions and say that absolutely for sure that playlist of intro lectures is complete beginner level. And so, this is already the deeper end, right? But the topics that I want to be coming back to throughout the next year and also throughout this semester, anthropology versus sociology, what's the difference? Timenergy, labor power versus Schole, OTM, and active leisure, the history of these kinds of critiques of a job-centric society and different ways of conceptualizing all of that, the antidotes to the PMC mode, and then general themes being the family and nurture, and then capital. And capital is the biggest of all of these. It's the biggest it is the backbone of all of these. And so today's lectures should be considered a sort of springboard into what we'll be doing with capital. And what will we be doing with capital? Well, outside of this lecture today, I'm announcing that, we finished with Being in Time. We finished with Totality and Infinity, the first half. The second half of Totality and Infinity is going to be January through February of 2025. But starting now is Das Kapital, the 3 volumes, and the Grundrisse. We're doing all of it, and I'm going to lecture on all of it. And when I say I'm going to lecture on all of it, I don't mean I'm not going to sit there and read it through with Nance and then we're going to talk about it. That was something that I was doing. It was called Capital Mondays for a while, and that was something that I was doing when I was very busy, and Nance was super available. And I was working at Amazon, and Nance was kind of always available, but the roles have changed. Now Nance is always busy, and I'm more available. And now that we're at that point, it's not going to just be reading through and talking about it. No, I'm going to do proper lectures. I'm going to read ahead of time. I'm going to take serious notes. Then I'm going to do lectures, usually on 40 pages at a time, give or take. And those lectures are going to be very like the Totality Infinity lectures, where once per week, the lecture is made to be accessible to people who have not done the reading, people who might be doing the reading that week or later on. And so they're going to be very intro level, but then there will be a deep dive a few days later for those people who are serious about doing the reading that week. And so that deep dive is where I go over all of my notes, and then everyone can bring in their question marks on the margins of their own pages, and then we can have a bigger conversation about translation and interpretation, potentially the second day, the day after the notes day. That was what it was for Totality Infinity. We'll see if that's how it's going to if that's how it's going to happen for Das Kapital. So that I just wanted to announce that that's going on. And it's not going to be all in one big sequence. That would be completely overwhelming. Instead, we would probably divide up volume 1 into thirds and then do intensive periods where I'm doing weekly lectures on capital, and then we take a break for a few weeks and then come back at it. And then over and over and over again like that. And so otherwise you'll never get to it. Otherwise I'll never get to it. So it has to happen. But yeah, with that said, we're going to kind of zoom out. We're obviously not going to get too into the weeds of capital, the 3 volumes. Today is about capital at kind of like this more intro level, but a little bit expanded. And so with that, I think we're ready for you, Anne, whenever you want to come up here. Everybody go ahead and put your hands together for Anne Snellgrove McKerracher. And as always, you don't have to have your camera on, but a couple people having it on and paying attention really does help from the standpoint of the lecturer, to feel like we're not just in a room full of lights here, but to feel like, oh yeah, no, there's actual people on the other side of all of this. There we go.
Dave always does this. He makes people clap for me. You don't have to do that. Like, he gave a guest lecture in my Soc 122 class a couple weeks ago. He's like, give it up for Anne. Isn't she doing a great job? And I was like, no, stop. 1 second. I'm holding things. Okay, so wage, labor, and capital. This is the first work by Marx that I ever read way back in like 2018 when I came into college, like a very left Democrat leaning individual. I knew, like when I was in high school, I just knew that I didn't like capitalism, but I didn't really know why. And I was down for Bernie back in 2016, but I also was like, oh, but Hillary is great. So like, I just kind of had this idea that I didn't like capitalism, but I didn't understand it. And so this was, like, reading this was just my first kind of dose of like real theory and real sociology, but it was also just my first stab at Marx and understanding what is actually meant by capital and capitalism. And so it was really fun to get to revisit this in the last few weeks as I prepared to teach this to a room of students who, when they hear capitalism, they either are very left and they're part of like local DSAs or whatever, and so they are just like, oh, I hate it too. Or they're like Republicans and TPUSA, which for those who live abroad, that's Turning Point USA, like Charlie Kirk, and it's just this organization that's like, capitalism's great, big government rocks. And they have branches all over college campuses, and so like the word capitalism and the idea of it is so politicized, I think, in their brains, or they don't know anything about it and they're just like normie 18-year-old consumers. And so it was a fun challenge to see, okay, how can I explain this thing to this demographic? And I think it went well. And so I'm going to more or less like recreate the way in which I explained it to them here, because I think it's just like a pretty good intro to this idea of capital and capitalism from the words of the man himself, Mr. Marx, Karl Marx. I highly recommend this reading, even if you didn't already get a chance to do it, because I think, and something I was telling my students, because I had them read Estranged Labor instead of this one, and I think they all got a lot more out of it than they were giving themselves credit for. So even though the language comes off as kind of convoluted at times because it's old, because it's complicated, it's easier to understand than probably we might give ourselves credit for, we might think and assume. And it starts off pretty entertaining because Engels has his like introduction to the reading saying, well, here I've changed a couple words around. When Marx said labor, what he actually meant is labor power, as he theorized in Capital. And I don't know, like the introduction by Engels is amusing because it's kind of humorous at times. So yeah, great reading, recommend it, but we'll break it down here. And so we start with our definition of what even is capital. And the way that Engels describes it, he says, economists will give us this definition that he breaks down here. He says, capital consists of raw materials, instruments of labor, and means of subsistence of all kinds, which are employed in producing new raw materials, new instruments, and new means of subsistence. Another way of thinking about capital, as actually Mikey put it in his piece, in his American translation of Bourdieu's Forms of Capital, because the same day I was talking about capital, I was also teaching Forms of Capital, and so I read Bourdieu and I read Mikey's piece, and Mikey defined it. He said it's economic capital in this sense is accumulated labor, which is all the things people have made through their collective work, through their social energy, and through collaboration with each other. And so capital is social energy. The way that I described it to my students to get them to think about it as not just money was I said it's the power and the potential to grow more, to make more, to do more, to accumulate more capital. And so I really wanted to drive into their minds that we're not just talking about money and actually having like economic capital or the machines, but it's having the power that allows for the potential to grow, to do more. And so we can think about it obviously in like the way Marx defined it, but really like power and potential to grow more is the way that I think made sense to them. They were like, okay. And so how exactly does capital work? How is it able to accumulate labor, and how is it able to accumulate this power and potential to get more capital? Well, we need that surplus value, which is the extra money that goes into the capitalist's pocket so that he can grow more, do more, create more, innovate more. And it is the labor power, as Marx sees it, that is what creates the value. And so Marx has his own example in here, but this is the example that I used. So let's say we have, I hope you all can see that. Yeah, Dave? Okay, cool. So let's say we just have like $20 of raw material over here. I don't know. That's some cotton, that's a machine, that this $20 goes to contributing to keep the machine running in a given year. I don't know, that's a needle. Like we've got our $20 of raw materials and supplies and machinery. And we're going to take that, we're going to turn that into a nice t-shirt with a happy face on it and sell that for $30. Wow, cool. How does $20 of random shit go towards a $30 t-shirt? Well, Billy Bob Joe here is sad because he's at work. He has to make it. And so it's through his labor power that this extra $10 of value gets created, because he took the stuff and he made it into something useful that can be sold, that people want to buy. And so Engels talks about this in the beginning, and he had like the humorous part. He goes, "But wait," says the worker, "I don't get $10 when I make a shirt. I only get paid $5 for every shirt that I get." Is it too low?
I just realized that this can... we don't use this
I don't need that. I know, it's kind of in the way. Okay, cool. I also think this is blocking my writing down here. Cool. Okay, cool. Well,
you need a sound.
Sweet. Right, so in this example, Billy Bob Joe's not getting the full $10 of that of the value that he created. No, he's getting, let's say if he's getting paid, by piece, he's only getting $5 for every t-shirt that he makes, whereas Mr. Bossman, capitalist, takes the extra 5. And so that's what he means when he says that the surplus value is created by the worker, because he was able to take the nothing and turn it into something, and that work created 10 extra dollars of value. But then, again, the capitalist will take some of that as his profit and as his capital. And so something I was driving home to my students is that it's not just greed. I think we can just conceptualize capital and capitalism and capitalists as they're just greedy. They just want money to have money. And in a practical sense, we can look at it and go, well, yeah, it's stupid that there are people who have different yachts and private jets made of gold, where there are people who are starving in the United States of America. And yeah, is that greedy? Could they be giving that money? Sure. But it's not just they want the money, it's they need the money, they need the capital to continue to grow, to continue to innovate, to continue to make more t-shirt factories and divide the labor, to create this division of labor, to create more t-shirts for cheaper, to continue growing. And so the capital allows them to accumulate more capital by innovating, by becoming more efficient, by having more warehouses and creating more and more and more for cheaper and cheaper. And so because of this, as Marx talks about in this piece, he says that the interests of the capitalist and the worker are necessarily opposed to each other, and that is because the rise of wages will always be disproportionate to the rise of capital, or vice versa. And usually it's the other way around, for the workers getting the short end of the stick, in the sense that he says that if capital is rising at a 30% rate, oh, great for the capitalist, business is doing well, but the the wages for the worker is also not rising at that rate. The wages of the worker is only going up, I think he said 5% in his example. And so when the capitalist is doing well, even if the workers' wages are going up, they're actually going down relative to, it's disproportionate, he talks about. And then if it were the opposite, in which the business wasn't doing so hot, but the worker still needed to pay for his labor power or the capitalist still needed to pay for the labor power for his worker, then yeah, the capitalist would not be so happy about paying a disproportionate more amount to his workers than what he's getting. And so their interests here are opposed, because so long as the rate of capital is going up, it's not going to be going up at the same rate. And so the relative wages decline for the worker. They don't go as far as they would, because this is going to impact the economy and the cost of goods. And also, it's going to affect, because wages are determined by the production. The worker is going to, on the one hand, feel pressured to compete with his other coworkers to get the spot, to be the best, to make more, because when the business is doing well, yes, the wages rise. They rise when you look at the numbers, but then when you take into account how much extra work and how much harder that worker ends up working to see the business succeed, relatively, they're not getting paid the amount of value that they're creating. They're not getting paid what they're worth. And so even when the worker goes, I'm going to work really, really hard for my boss, he's still getting the short end of the stick, because he's frying all of his energy and putting it all into work. And I think that because at this point in my class, I had already told the students about Timenergy. They were all really excited about this idea. We're thinking about it. And so I connected back to Timenergy, and there's some specific quotes, or there's one specific chunk I'll read here from Wage, Labor, and Capital, where I think you can really see the relation to Timenergy that I imagine anyone who's familiar with the concept would go, oh, I see the connection here. And so he says, consequently, labor power is a commodity with which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to the capitalist. But why does he sell it? It is in order to live. But the putting of labor power into action, the work, is the active expression of the laborer's own life. And this life activity he sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means of life. His life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing his own existence, right? So when Dave says that Timenergy gets sold as labor power, gets turned into labor power, like life activity, we could just replace Timenergy here, and I think it would still read the same. He works that he may keep alive. He does not count the labor itself as part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity that he has auctioned off to another. The product of his activity, therefore, is not the aim of his activity. What he produces for himself is not the silk that he weaves, not the gold that he draws up the mining shaft, not the palace that he builds. What he produces for himself is wages, and the silk, the gold, and the palace are resolved for him into a certain quantity of necessaries of life, perhaps into a cotton jacket, into copper coins, and into a basement dwelling. And the laborer who for 12 long hours weaves, spins, bores, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stone, carries hods, and so on, is this 12 hours weaving, spinning, boring, turning, building, shoveling, and stone breaking regarded by him as a manifestation of life, as life? Quite the contrary. Life for him begins when this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours' work, on the other hand, has no meaning for him as weaving, spinning, boring, and so on, but only as earnings, which enable him to sit down at a table, to take his seat in the tavern, and to lie down in a bed. If the silkworm's object in spinning were to prolong its existence as a caterpillar, it would be a perfect example of a wage worker, right? So there he's just saying, the worker doesn't go to work because he loves to make cotton t-shirts at the factory and that's what his life's all about. No, he goes to work so he can get the money to not only have his means of subsistence met, meaning having food, having shelter, having, those necessaries that just reproduce him to go to work the next day, but so that he can have some extra to go to the bar with his friends and to have a nice dinner with his family. And so he's producing, yes, he's like at the factory creating or producing the cotton t-shirt, but what the worker's producing for himself is wages, but then also he's necessarily creating alienation and estrangement from the product and from himself, which Marx develops in Estranged Labor, which I suppose I won't get too much into right now, just to say that I think this paragraph sort of kind of like hints at where he's going in Estranged Labor, and just that, the worker's not there because he wants to be and because he finds this work so fulfilling. He's there because he has to be. His time, his life activity, his time energy is not his own. It belongs to the employee. Therefore, he is alienated from the actual process. He's alienated from the product because he doesn't get to keep the t-shirts that he makes. Maybe he'll make enough wages to go buy that $30 t-shirt, but he doesn't get those. And he's becoming alienated from himself and from other workers because that time, his time and energy in a given day, 12 hours a day in some of these cases, is not his own anymore. It doesn't belong to him. So he's alienated from himself in that sense too. Let's see. And then the way that I explained to students, because a great point that they brought up, especially when thinking about alienated labor, is they go, like one of my students, for example, said, well, hey, I work at a gym and I get a free gym membership as I work there. So I get to reap the benefits, and I really like that world, and I'm learning a lot, and like I'm passionate about this job. Same with this rise of professional and managerial positions in which hopefully ideally like you're doing something that you love. I tell the students, I hope you're all here majoring in something that you care about, that you will hopefully have a career in, that you somewhat enjoy. But it is still not your time. Like, even if you care about the project, you're really invested, you're still selling and taking 8 hours of time in your day, and you're selling it to someone else for their productivity, for their business. And so even if you enjoy the work, the time is not your own. And the example that I know Dave has used in the past and that I used when talking about this is thinking about, like, let's say you are a barista at a coffee shop and you love it. It's your favorite job. I know when I was a barista in college, I loved it. I loved making coffee or latte art. Like, that was my favorite thing. You're a barista and you love your job and you're so good at it, and you get a couple free coffees every day, and maybe they sell pastries and you get a free pastry. It's like a really great gig for what's going on. But let's say you work the closing shift, and which the store closes at 4 p.m. and from 3 to 4 p.m. it is very, very slow, and sometimes nobody walks in at all, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm literally doing nothing. There's nothing to do here. I just want to go home. But you can't, because it is your labor power, meaning your potential to help a customer should they walk in, your time just to be there, idle and ready to go, is what's being sold. So even if you love your job, no matter what, in this example, or if you're working at an office, like, you have to work a certain amount of time, even if there's nothing to do. And so that's what's meant by, your labor power is being sold. Your time is not your own in that chunk of 8 hours that you're working. Even if you're allowed to sit behind the desk and read a book or scroll on your phone, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, man, I've got homework and laundry I'd rather be doing, or I'd like to go to the grocery store. But no, you can't start closing up until right when the place closes. And so that is how I think I was able to help students understand that, even if you like your job, and especially now, like, we're not working these 12-hour weaving, spinning, boring jobs that wage laborers were in industrial England, the time is still not your own. And that's the point. And that's what's meant by your labor power is being sold, and it's producing this value for the capitalist. And so even though the interests of the capitalist and the worker are opposed, like in this example, because of the disproportionate rise and fall of wages versus capital, the worker and the capitalist need each other, and they almost reproduce each other, according to Marx. Let's see here. And so I'll read another chunk here that kind of breaks this down as to why the two need each other even though their interests are opposed. So he says, let us take an example. For 1 shilling, a laborer works all day long in the fields of a farmer, to whom he thus secures a return of 2 shillings. The farmer not only receives the replaced value which he has given to the day laborer, he has doubled it. Therefore, he has consumed the 1 shilling that he gave to the day laborer in a fruitful, productive manner. For the 1 shilling, he has bought the labor power of the day laborer, which creates products of the soil of twice the value, and out of 1 shilling makes 2. So the capitalist needs the wage worker, needs his day laborer, because this day laborer took 1 shilling and turned it into 2 shillings. Capitalist ain't gonna do that. He needs this guy to do it. Whereas the day laborer, on the contrary, receives in the place of his productive force, whose results he has just surrendered to the farmer 1 shilling, which he exchanges for means of subsistence, which he consumes more or less quickly. The 1 shilling has therefore been consumed in a double manner, reproductively for the capitalist, for it has been exchanged for labor power, which brought forth 2 shillings, unproductively for the worker, for it has been exchanged for means of subsistence which are lost forever, and whose value he can obtain again only by repeating the same exchange with the farmer, right? So the wage worker needs, in this economy, in this situation, he needs to go to work for the capitalist to get his 1 shilling to go buy his food, which, now he eats the food, now the food is gone, and in 5 to 10 hours, it's really going to be gone forever. And he's like, well, I need another shilling so I can eat again tomorrow. Better go back. And the capitalist is like, great, because I need you to make my 1 shilling. And the worker's like, great, I need my 1 shilling to buy my McDonald's. And it reproduces itself in this way that Marx is talking about it. So capital, therefore, presupposes wage labor presupposes capital. They condition each other, and they bring the other into existence. And so, I think I'm, closing out here because this piece is more or less, straightforward in that here's how capitalists work, or capital works. Here's the relationship between the capitalist and the wage worker. Here's how wage labor produces that surplus value that the capitalist needs. Here's why their interests are opposed. And he closes out by saying, well, what effect does this actually have on the capitalist class, the middle class, and the working class? And like I kind of talked about earlier with this ever-growing production process for the capitalist, labor and the process of labor becomes cheaper and cheaper through the division of labor, and the worker necessarily feels like in order to keep up, in order to get his share of the wages, he needs to compete with his other workers. He needs to work a lot harder and make more and kind of strain himself at the warehouse or at the factory. And then because the labor just becomes so monotonous and so easy to do, and therefore so easily replaceable, children can start doing it. Women can start doing it. There is no expertise needed. There is no real knowledge other than, okay, your job is to push this button all day long, or your job is to screw this onto that. It's so divided that each worker only has to do one simple task. So if that worker's sick or dies or says, I don't want to work here anymore, great. You can just infinitely reproduce them with women and children and anyone. And so the process can just keep going and going for the capitalist, and he can build more and more capital, and the worker is just kind of getting screwed over, as Marx talks about in his volumes of Capital, which I know Dave is going to take our kind of introduction here and expand upon it and give us some more terms that are confusing. Thanks, Marx. But unless you want to add anything, Dave, or have any questions, I think we'll switch gears to Dave. Yeah, I guess I'll ask if anyone in the audience has any questions about wage labor and capital specifically, or any comments. Okay, that's the mute. Looks like we're good on that end.
Thank you, Anne. She hates it.
Do theater for fun. People applause, but then I'm like, no, don't stop.
You only get the symbolic capital from doing something that gives recognition if you perform hating the recognition. That's what Bourdieu would say. All right. Thank you, Anne. Yeah, and I think, who was it in the chat? Cesar said that Anne was doing a great job keeping it normie level. Normies of the world unite. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch on here, is that this is not the most normie accessible book, this one right here. Not just because of its length and the fact that none of us have time energy, and this obviously requires some degree of time energy to be able to undertake as a challenge, but also, if you've ever heard a Marxist talk, it's just jargon and it melts your brain and it sucks and I hate it. And even for like me or Mikey, like we've spent so much time in the world of theory and also so much time with Marx, but then like you hear some Marxists start talking and it's just like, what are you guys talking? Can you guys just talk like people, please? And I think it's similar with Lacan. It's similar with any of these people who become devotees or acolytes to a specific thinker, right? And so, I've made a big point of stating that I am in the process of deprogramming or reprogramming or retraining myself in how I speak. It requires a serious effort on my part. But I feel some kind of responsibility to sort of balance my fragmented and many big others. And the Marxist big other is not more important to me than the people in my life, from the various kinds of jobs that I've worked, or from the various kinds of classes that I've taught, or from the music scene back in the day, or from whatever. Like I maintain those relationships, and I don't want to be unintelligible to them if they ever want to get into this kind of stuff. And I'm not ready to speak to them yet, right? But Timenergy was the first major sort of innovation in an attempt to talk about these things with normal people, right? So life activity in both wage labor and capital, but also in a strange labor activity, is more or less something we could substitute for time energy, right? Life activity, time energy. But life activity sounds like it's something that's actively going on, whereas time energy includes the potential to do life activity in the same way that labor power includes the potential to do something. But we can symbolize time energy when we're speaking loosely here by just crossing out time energy, because the point is that we don't have our time energy, which is to say we can't do things with other people, because the potential and the reality of large energy-infused, repeatable blocks of time reliably between us is crossed out by a job-centric society that requires us to see ourselves and maximize ourselves as labor power, to compete with one another, to be labor power in the day laborer, wage worker level, or to kind of constantly work on ourselves to make ourselves some part of the professional or managerial elite. And of course, I don't think most of us know any professional or managerial elites, do we? We know petty PMCs, in the same way that we can talk about the petty bourgeoisie being like the small business owner. Well, the petty PMC would be like the middle management kind of person, right? Like the person who's or the maybe they're a professional, but like they're not like, they're not making millions, they're not worth millions. Maybe they get six-figure salaries, but it's probably like 200,000, not 900,000. I don't know. I'm ballparking here. We'll leave the specifics for more scientific minds, but the point is that labor power can be thought of as the simplest form of labor. I don't know how to spell simplest. Is that an E or an I? I don't care. So we have as the simplest form of labor versus sophisticated or qualified or educated labor power, right? Higher skilled is another way of thinking about that. right? Professions obviously are going to be a lot higher skilled. Okay. And the reason why we care is not because we're necessarily looking to do the worker revolution today. We are interested if that's necessary. Is the revolutionary subject or the subject of social change going to be the proletarian masses? Is it going to be the people who are putting themselves on the gears of production? Is it going to be something that comes out of this sort of immiserated mass of industrial workers who see a common cause from their situation where they are already working collectively to produce amazing wealth, yet they have none of it? And by stepping away from the gears of production, they are able to stop the machine, literally, right? Is that the agent of social change still today? Part of the problem, obviously, is the PMC. Another part of the problem is the new medium. And also the question of, does the new medium actually invert the relations here where we prioritize the mode of production as base over superstructure, which is to say culture, but also for Marxists that included politics and law and ideology, even like the church, basically almost everything in the institutional matrix, right, belongs to this superstructure, whereas the base is the mode of production itself. And of course, McLuhan's point is that the medium inverts the relations, the causal relations here, and makes it so that in a very real sense, the superstructure becomes more important. Well, of course, the base is the condition of possibility for everything that happens in the superstructure. If it's not for people creating the vehicles and the oil and the sugar and coffee beans and all of the other things, the homes that we live in, the roads that we drive on, if it's not for people at the level of production making all of that possible, well then we're not going to have anything remotely similar to what we currently have at this sort of superstructural level, of course. But the issue is that the base, the mode of production, is so globalized, so fragmented, so dispersed that it's hard for workers to look over and just see one another in the same situation. I don't think even the most immiserated among us see ourselves as like being in the same situation as a child in the Congo who is mining cobalt for our PlayStations or smartphones. And of course we can do an intellectual exercise and say that we're all in the same boat together. And of course we are subject to the same market forces in a sort of sense. But it's less obvious and it requires an intellectual exercise. It's a theoretical exercise. And it's one that we don't see. The medium today makes it possible so that we could see it, right? We could see it. If we go out of our way, we can see it. If you've ever seen a movie like Blood Diamond, for instance, maybe you've seen a glimpse of it. But for the most part, the ghetto is no longer obvious either. Outside of some classic inner city areas, the slums today are divided up. They're fragmented. They're dispersed, right? Instead of there being all the poor people in one part of town, there are trailer parks here and there and there and over there. And those people do not live alongside one another. They don't get to organize with each other. They don't see themselves in a common situation. This gets us to this sort of post-class fractured mass situation. And of course, that's not to exhaust that thesis, and we're not going to go fully into it right now, but that is the basic situation. The medium, the internet, could make it very obvious for us all the conditions of possibility for all of the things that we tend to take for granted. It could make very obvious for us all the fact of third world slave labor, for instance, right? But instead, that's kind of like this niche. Such concerns have been monopolized by a niche part of the world of activism, and the world of activism already carries a certain kind of stigma. It's naive, it's student driven, it's in the PMC mode, it's virtue hoarding, and it also has a lot of pet concerns that are arguably way more divisive and prioritized over and above the literal slave labor that is occurring in the global South. And it's part of the issue is who has monopolized that discourse? Who has monopolized such concerns? And bringing it back to what Cesar had said, we want this to be normie friendly. Well, in our attempt to reprogram ourselves to be able to talk about these things in a way that is not part of this standard and already co-opted PMC mode that only is meant to push a certain kind of blue county progressive left, right? We have our work cut out for ourselves. And now I already announced at the beginning of this, but now that Nancy's here, I'll just kind of reiterate. We're kicking off a new century, a new era, did I say century? We're kicking off a new era of Theory Underground here with the Capital Seminar. And so we are doing all of the stuff I already laid out in the plan. And of course, one of the things that I had said was capital. And I wanted to sort of belabor the point that making it normie accessible is the point. But not just, we have to learn how to talk about Marx's concerns for people who don't understand or will be put off by Marxist terminology. We have to find a way to use different signifiers to signify basically the same thing. That's where a lot of lefties go. But we're not all lefties here, and I'm not saying that at all. No, because there's the difference between the signifier, which is the word we actually use, and the signified, what we're actually trying to point at. And most people want to change the signifiers because they get in the way. They're tainted. There's a stigma there, or they are too jargony. But the signified is still the same, right? It's still the same situation with capital, right? And then part of the issue is not only do we have to change how we talk about things, we have to also change our conceptualization so as to better track with the changed conditions of the signified itself, which is to say the referent in material reality. So if none of that made sense, don't worry. The point is simply this. The situation, I'll put it here on the board, the situation has changed. Now, has it changed in a way that means we don't have to talk about capital anymore? Absolutely not. But the situation has changed. So it's not just, for instance, the signifier, capital, proletariat, socialism. It's not just that these signifiers have to be swapped out for something less tainted by the failures of the 20th century. It's that the signified, what we're actually trying to get at when we talk about these things, is the situation, it has changed. And it has changed in the ways that we're trying to get at with CMT, with PMC, professional managerial critique, critical media theory, also CDT, right? Trying to engage people at the level of doxa, their doxa, self-help, business success, PMC memoirs, trying to intercept and engage and insert ourselves into the discourse, but also trying to figure out a way of doing that that is critical, that is sympathetic, and that ultimately brings it all back around to the thing that we should be able to all agree about, which is that time energy is the precondition for the good life. It is the means towards the good life, the means towards the end of us living a life that has purpose, where we are able to explore, discover, and cultivate our talents and our relationships. That's a more succinct way of saying something I've been trying to say for a long time. And so here in the next 3 years of Theory Underground, the point is to go over all of Das Kapital and the Grundrisse and the major extension packs or expansion packs on that project, both in terms of the political theory that said this is what must be done, as well as the critical theory that said that did not work. Why did that not work? What about the situation has changed? What about the human subject was not understood? And to be able to go all over that, to get all over it with all of you. And in doing so, we'll all kind of come up with our own approaches. We'll all kind of come up with our own theories. And hopefully, along the way, there will be certain things that we all discover work really well. Other things might be debatable, and the contrast and comparison between these different positions and takes and whatnot will be illuminating. But ultimately, there's going to be some overlap and some stuff that we generally find useful, such as the concept of time energy. There's lots of other stuff along those lines. All right, but the situation today, I think one thing that we all agree on, and now I'm saying we, as in the Cluck, Dave, Ann, Mikey, Nance, the Cluck. I don't know. You'll understand that term, the Cluck, once you read Mikey's theory fiction at the end of his book that is supposed to be released 3 months ago. It'll eventually come out. Don't worry. Nance has already read it, I think. I've already read most of it. Anne is currently proofing it, and it will be published soon. But Mikey's also like, no, but I really have to finish this one section. And so it's getting drawn out. But the Cluck is basically me, Nance, and Mikey, as I said. And when I'm saying we all agree on something, that's kind of crazy because we don't agree on that much. Really, if you drill down, we do come to radically different positions on various things. But what we all agree on is that this right here, MCM prime, is the motor of our worlds today. The motor of our worlds today. MCM prime is the circuit of capital. And I want to turn to page 247 of Das Kapital Volume 1 to just read off what that is about. So if you don't have a copy handy, no worries. It's all right. 247. You can always look at it later. Remember, there's certain books that are going to become your best friends if you're a real thinker. And this one's never going to go away. Unless you want to be that kind of thinker who likes to drink wine and never think about where things come from. At the bottom of page 247, he says, the first distinction between money as money and money as capital is nothing more than a difference in their form of circulation. The direct form of the circulation of commodities is CMC, the transformation of commodities into money and the reconversion of money into commodities, selling in order to buy. Up here on the board, you can see CMC is above MCM prime. And so, yeah, this makes sense. Let's go back to, in the conditions of the English working class, the weaver, remember, who just got compared to a silkworm by Papa Marx, right? The weaver in Engels's amazing work of sociology, proto-sociology, the conditions of the English working class, the weaver used to work with his family using very basic tools to, let's just say, make clothing, right? And so they were sewing, they were weaving, however you want to say it. And they were producing commodities, which is C. And then they would exchange those for money, which is M. And then they would trade that money for other commodities. But the issue was the priority in their life was making things to sell, to get money, to have their basic necessities met. Hello, beautiful listener. I see you. Just kidding. I can't. But I have to interrupt this just really quick to make my own advertisement, my very own, the one that says subscribing, liking, commenting. It actually makes a really big difference. So even if you're just on the free side, shout out to you. Thanks for doing it. Make sure to subscribe and all that. Especially people on the podcast, make sure to say something nice in the reviews. It actually really helps. And I need reviews on every platform, all right? Because I just hate to say it, it matters, you know? I try not to chase the almighty algorithm, but also I don't want to have all of this beautiful content go to waste. And so I'm trying to walk a fine line between quality and quantity. And I come out way heavier on the side of quality, as you can obviously see we do here. But come on, let's push that subscribe button, you know? Let's smash that like button, you know? Like teach the algorithm what you actually care about, all right? And then maybe it'll show it to other people. That's great. All right, let's get back to it. And then they went about their lives after that. They might have been serfs, and they might not have had real sort of robust, what we would consider liberal rights, representation and recognition within the political order. They might not have had that, but you can definitely bet they had more time than we do. They had a less stressful time than we do. Unless, of course, they were being raped and pillaged at the moment, right? So, of course, there was kind of like this, the condition and possibility of them being able to have this sort of utopian life that Engels lays out is that it's a peace period, right? Their sons are not being dragged off to war, and their daughters aren't being raped by invading forces. Like that's, so outside of that dark scenario that is overly simplistically gendered, but that is kind of how war is, you had a Shire-like existence, like the Hobbits in Lord of the Rings. You don't have to watch the 3 movies. Definitely don't watch the 3 Hobbit ones, but you can just watch the first 20 minutes of Fellowship of the Ring to get a good idea of how Engels thinks of how life was prior to industrialization, right? The time spent outside of weaving and growing carrots or potatoes or what have you, that time outside of that was spent dancing, telling stories, making delicious food, and sharing it with one another. These are the wholesome arts. The wholesome arts. They're not exactly the liberal arts. This is all kind of at the level of humanity prior to the liberal arts. And could you bring me my water bottle, by the way? I think it must be down there. I can't find it anywhere. But anyway, the circuit of CMC is that Shire-like existence, which he called selling in order to buy. And when we say buying, sure, sometimes you might buy something extra nice. But the point was, for the most part, it's buying for your needs, aka means of subsistence, MOS, is a good shorthand for that. Thank you, Ann. For your needs. Think of Baloo, singing about the bare necessities. I mean the bare necessities. That's what we need. And when you have your bare necessities taken care of, you get to spend the rest of your day being like Baloo, dancing around, picking prickly pears or whatever, and having a good time. That's the basic idea. That is something kind of like the good life. Though, of course, I think that we're all going to say we want nicer things. We're like Glaucon from from Plato's Republic. We're all going to say, that's not good enough, Socrates. We want to have nicer things. And of course, for Glaucon, he means caviar and wine. But for us, it also just means being able to pursue the liberal arts, right? What I was calling the wholesome arts might be considered the proto-liberal arts. But the liberal arts are a level of sophistication that only comes from schole being freed up. Schole, aka OTM, being active, stress-free leisure time, which gets conflated with time energy, right? I've told Daniel Tutt multiple times that time energy is the precondition of labor power and OTM. Time energy is not the same thing as OTM. Labor power is not the same thing as time energy. And then he just published something last week where he says that what I'm saying with time energy is what he's saying with OTM. And it's like, dude, I keep saying that's not what it is. Like, you're completely missing the point. You might as well conflate labor and labor power. It's that big of a difference. And so, no, time energy is the condition for both labor power and schole, aka otium. But the point is that schole, which is stress-free, cool, calm, and collected, active leisure, the kind that Adorno had, that is conditioned by the overwhelming majority of people having to work. And so I'll just do an inverted pyramid here, because obviously only a few people in the society are going to be down here at the point, the top of the pyramid, or the bottom with it upside down. And the overwhelming majority of us spend our lives not necessarily laboring, but at least preparing ourselves to labor. Which is, I mean, you could argue, if you want to do a labor all the way down sort of argument, you could argue that the mentally preparing yourself to do labor is labor, which is, of course, kind of where Adorno's coming from with his essay on free time that we started off the Critical Doxology and Time Energy series talking about, right? Free time. The time off the clock is still on the clock because you're recreating your labor power with recreational activities, right? But there's that difference between literally doing some active labor and mentally preparing yourself to go back into the workplace and do that, right? It requires steeling your mind. While steeling your mind to go back to work undermines the conditions of possibility for schole, which is to say stress-free, cool, calm, and collected, active leisure. And the reason is, it should be pretty obvious. Even once you've recharged your energy in a week after a long work week, if you're stressing about having to go back to work or having to go find a job, then you're obviously not able to just kind of leisurely walk over and say, I'm going to start practicing this musical instrument. Duh. Now, this is obvious for us, but it's not always obvious for everyone. And that's because we do have a lot of people in our lives, even if they don't just drink wine and like to not think about where things come from, they've bought into a worldview and certain ruts for perceiving the world that was created by people who are like that. People like Robin DiAngelo, right? People for whom everything is a never-ending wine party. A wine party? No one says that. Let's just say a wine tasting or something. I don't know. I don't know what these people do. So there's a problem, though. We don't live in that world. We are not those weavers. We're in this world that I'm describing, obviously, which is one characterized by a different circuit, not the one of CMC, selling in order to buy, but instead, on 248, he says, alongside this form, which was CMC, we find another form, which is quite distinct from the first, MCM, the transformation of money into commodities and the reconversion of commodities into money. buying in order to sell. Money, which describes the latter course in its movement, is transformed into capital, becomes capital, and from the point of view of its function, already is capital. Can someone Google the definition of capital really quick and then read that off? That'd be really nice of you. It looks like Nance is on it. Is he? Or is it Ann? One of you two. Yeah, Nance has got it. All right. What's the definition of capital there?
Wealth in the form of money or other assets owned by a person or organization or available or contributed for a particular purpose, such as starting a company or investing.
Wealth and machinery and stuff is one way of talking about it, but specifically we're talking about wealth, machinery, and stuff that is trying to make babies. The feudal lord who is wealthy is not a capitalist. The miser who is wealthy is not a capitalist. Ebenezer Scrooge in The Christmas Carol might be a business owner, but he is not a capitalist because the surplus from the entire, was it a printing press that he was running? I forget what it was that they were doing exactly, but Tiny Tim's dad works for him, right? He doesn't want to give him Christmas off, famously. It's a Charles Dickens story, right? And being a Charles Dickens story, obviously it's about capitalism during the time that Marx is thinking about. And Ebenezer Scrooge is not pinching pennies and trying to maximize profits for the sake of investing into a diversified portfolio so that he can ultimately grow his capital. No, he's keeping it all maybe in gold bars under a pillow somewhere, right? So that money is not making babies. So it's not really capital. Now, obviously, he's in a system of capitalism, and so he's still serving a function as a capitalist because it's still a business. But in terms of what that money is becoming functionally, here, I remember in this quote, he said, from the point of view of its function, this money that is going to be invested is already capital. Well, that money's not really capital if it's not really being used, right? Now, it could be potentially used. Someone could steal it and then go invest it. So, of course, it's still potentially capital. But the way that Scrooge is using it, it's not capital. Okay. Same with the feudal lord who builds up the walls of the castle and is constantly giving gifts to his retainers, right? In that situation, there's wealth, but it's not being invested into some diversified portfolio meant to ultimately grow. Now, an important question for us as we move into capital for real is this prime symbol on the circuit of capital, MCM prime. Does it mean increase or does it mean change? Because the point is like you could lose that money. You're investing it and you could lose it. And one of a student in my class, the one student who actually cares about this kind of stuff outside of class and cared about it before signing up for the class, he brought up the point that he understands that this prime symbol is not just about increase, but it's about variability and the fact that it might go up, it might go down. Well, the tendency for capital is that it's always for the sake of going up. And so either the fact that the prime symbol is pointing up, I just want to say it's very intuitive to just look at this and think money for the sake of commodities, for the sake of more money. Money go up. That's what we're talking about. To say that this rules cash rules everything around me. To say that money rules the world is a step behind where you actually say capital is running the world. And the circuit of capital directs everything. But what I really want to drive home today is that it's not just that money rules everything, or that, oh, everybody wants to always turn a dollar. Everybody's always trying to maximize their profits. Oh, because saying it that way makes it sound like it's about greed. It makes it sound like it's about, well, we could have ethical businesses. Maybe if our businesses were more cooperatively managed. Maybe if they looked at, hey, let's turn more of our profit back into dividends that go back to the actual employees. Let's shorten the work week and pay people more. And then it's not capitalism per se. It's actually something more ethical, right? Well, that's not what we're getting at when we think about the circuit of capital running the world. And I kind of just want to do a very vulgar, very simplistic reason why here for you all. And it's basically this. In the example that Anne was using of, you've got the cotton plus the labor power equals, and so $20 spent on cotton and labor power equals $30 you sell this shirt for in our example. Okay, in this example, and we'll go ahead and just make this a price tag coming off of the shirt. Okay, the $10 of profit, this $10 here, does not go back into the capitalist's pocket. It doesn't get put into a savings account. It gets invested. And it's not necessarily invested back into the exact same business. Like I said, a diversified portfolio is kind of the point. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to invest in lots of different things. But what does that actually mean? When a businessman wants to start a business and needs starter capital, and either needs it from a bank, or needs it from his own savings, his saved wages, or needs it from a pool of other people's saved wages, whatever. It's not just for the brick and mortar and for the means of production, right? So the means of production over here, MOP, means of production, versus the labor power, the cost of which would basically be the means of subsistence, MOS. It's not just for the actual factory or the actual tools, which would be the means of production. One of the most defining characteristics of capitalism is that the factory is not enough. Fixing the factory is not enough. Yes, things deteriorate over time. Yes, you have to set aside a certain percentage of the profits, and therefore it's not really profits, it's just part of the operating costs to maintain those means of production. But part of the maintenance of the means of production means you got to stay competitive. And to keep a competitive edge, some of this money that is coming out on the side of profit, I'm just going to put that in quotes, profit, is being spent on research and development. When we say that capital's running everything, it's not just that our time energy is put under erasure because we spend our whole lives qualifying ourselves as labor power on the market. We're competing to prepare ourselves to be on the market, which is what schooling is kind of about. Research and development means that science, technology, engineering, and math are directed towards the ends of capital. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, are directed towards capital. What does that mean right now? Well, it means that all the technology that we're using, all the technology that is frustratingly breaking down all of the time, constantly becoming outdated, or even supposedly more efficient at the exact same time that it becomes less functional, like Bluetooth technology. right? Bluetooth technology, so frustrating. I am at a complete wit's end with Bluetooth right now. I have bought several pieces of hardware and I've messed with software, and I've tried to get Bluetooth working on this computer properly. And for some reason, Bluetooth just keeps getting worse. It's worse on my phone now than it was 5 years ago. There's something off about Bluetooth. I don't understand what's going on. But the point is that science, technology, engineering, and math are not directed towards use value. Now, remember needs and means of subsistence being the point of CMC. That's all about use value. But our world is focused on exchange value. I'll just put that over here. Exchange value. And in Wage, Labor, and Capital, and I don't have my copy handy. I left it on campus by accident. I think it's like the page after. I don't know if Ann could find it, but it's like the page after when he defines capital at the top of section 2. I think it's like the page later that he says, but capital is not just machines and wealth and means of subsistence all aggregated together. No, it's actually a bunch of exchange values, because all of everything, all of the different levels of capital, all of the commodities making up the means of production, but also the means of subsistence, right? When we think of means of production, simplistically, we can think of factories, but ultimately the tools needed to extend our value. Versus means of subsistence, and just thinking simplistically, we could think of food, right? The point is that our food and our tools are commodities, which is to say, not use values. I'll cross out use values on the whiteboard. Not use values. Yes, they're useful, or we wouldn't buy them. But they're not made just to be useful. They're not meant to max out usefulness. They're meant to max out the way that they are able to valorize capital, which is to say, harvest surplus value. And now the main thing I want to say about surplus value is that there's two kinds of it. There's absolute surplus value, and then there's relative surplus value. But let's go over what surplus value is again. I think the way that Ann was talking about it was wonderful. It was perfect. But basically, surplus value is that extra $10 that was made off of the t-shirt once the tools and the labor were combined to make that shirt. The extra value brought in over and above the cost of its production, that's the surplus value, right? But one of the important points, and most important points perhaps, is that labor power is a commodity, meaning that it serves the law of value. The law of value, I gotta rewrite that. The law of value simply states that the commodity is generally going to, on average, be priced at the cost of its production. And the cost of the production of the commodity, which is on average going to be its price, is socially necessary labor time. The socially necessary labor time is the average time it takes to make that thing in a society. Meaning, without knowing anything about the workers, just taking them as an average workforce, just thinking in the most basic terms, the cost of these markers is going to be something, right? It's going to be something. Well, how would we calculate what the cost of these markers is going to be? It's the cost of the labor to produce the markers combined with the cost of the tools or the factories necessary for making these markers. Why the law of value functions to make it so that all commodities, including labor power, are going to more or less get priced at the cost of their socially necessary labor to be produced is one of the big questions to be thinking about when approaching capital, and I don't need to get into it fully right now. It has to do with competition. It has to do with research and development. It has to do with workers competing to lower themselves to get the jobs for lower and lower wages, but it also has to do with the capitalists competing between each other, right? So they lose their competitive edge over time as everybody gets more or less equal tools, machines, factories. And at that point, when they're really competing with one another, they have to lower their prices. And so they lower their prices as much as they possibly can. Well, when you lower your prices as much as you possibly can because of competition, you still have to make enough to keep producing the things. So on average, things come out down to the cost of their production, right? That doesn't mean that things are always being sold at the level of their production. And there's a big question mark on what really is the cost of the production of a commodity. Is a box of LaCroix really worth $4 or $6 if you're in Hawaii? Is it really worth that much? What about Pepsi or Coke products? There's a can. It's an aluminum can. And then there's the syrup and the water that get mixed and made bubbly. What's the term? I don't know. It doesn't matter. That's not that elaborate of a process. Once they have that down, it should be pretty basic. But there's some way that these monopolies more or less establish themselves and work together to shut out competition, and then they kind of get to set their prices and work with one another. That's kind of this duopolistic sort of thing that they're able to do. They're not necessarily lowering their prices to the actual cost of production. But then we could talk about, well, what about advertising? Is advertising a part of the cost of the production? Well, what about potentially like legal contracts and or business partnerships that make it difficult for competitors to come in and undermine the prices that Coke and Pepsi are setting their products at, right? Like there's all this extra organizational as well as advertising work that goes into making it so that they can more or less set the prices that they are able to set. Yes, someone could come in there and sell. I mean, think about LaCroix especially. For those who don't know, like we're talking, LaCroix, some people say. We're talking about LaCroix, right? Like, it doesn't matter. We're talking about carbonated water with a hint of a flavor being sold at the same price as a Pepsi product that has all of these kinds of high fructose corn syrup and other artificial flavors added into it. How is basically just water being the same price as a Pepsi or Coke product? The point is, I want to put a big question mark over the cost of production. What is the cost of production in the 21st century? Is it really just the cost of the raw materials? Or is it also the cost of the advertising and the kinds of organizational activities, the kinds of contracts, the kinds of business associations, the kinds of people shaking hands around tables that makes it difficult for us to start our own little thing that would then sell the same box for $1, right? I don't know. It's a question, but the law of value is simply saying that on average, this price tag that I'm going to put here is going to reflect the cost of its production. Okay, but what is the cost of production of this commodity called labor power? That's your rent. So labor power up here. Labor power's price tag equals the cost of its means of subsistence. Well, what is the cost of our means of subsistence? rent, food, insurance, phone. You need a phone if you want a job most of the time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Rent, food, insurance, phone, potentially some kind of like a beer budget, a marijuana budget, a Netflix budget. There has to be something to make it so you don't kill yourself. And so whatever the things are that you have to have in a given week to make it so you can keep going back to work and not having a meaningful life and having your entire horizon of possibilities foreclosed because you don't have time and energy to explore, discover, and cultivate your talents or relationships. Because you don't have that, you ultimately need some way of coping. And so your coping mechanisms ultimately cost money as well. What is your coping mechanisms? Some degree of cope is necessary for reproducing you as labor power. And if that means binging Netflix or having a couple of cold ones in the evening or what have you, well, then so be it. Is that really necessary? We spend our entire lives arguing with ourselves over what is necessary and then trying to go on some new diet or trying to cut this thing out of our lives, trying to cut that thing out of our lives. And why are we doing that? Why do we develop a hatred for certain modes of consumption that feel like like a habit or like a crutch, right? Like almost an addiction in some cases. Part of what is that, Nance?
No, just like we've all internalized the propaganda to where we're all worthless pieces of shit. Because if we were any better, we wouldn't be in the situation we're currently in. So it must be our fault. We must be too fat. We must be too ugly. We must be lazy slobs.
Exactly. And so the point is though we it doesn't even require like some mass propaganda endeavor on the part of capitalists. We'll do it ourselves to ourselves. This self-valorization, this making ourselves more competitive. And part of making ourselves more competitive is this conversation that we have to have about like, okay, well, could we cut this cost out? Could we cut that cost out and still have a decent life? And by doing that, we're competing for lower wages. By doing that, instead of organizing together to get higher wages so that we could afford nicer things or better houses or what have you, or more time off, we're instead competing between one another by blaming ourselves and everyone else for their consumption habits, right? Okay, that's kind of, it is directly related, but I don't want to get too in the weeds here. Just keeping it really simple before I close out. The point is that the cost of the production of you as labor power is the average cost of your means of subsistence. And the average cost of your means of subsistence is all of those things like rent and food and insurance and phone, potentially also coping mechanisms and that recreational activities. But of course, we're going to constantly diet and try to simplify all of that. And that is ultimately good for helping make it so that they really don't have to pay us as much, right? This is like deets. Is that how you say it, Anne? What's the term? Please, what's the name? I know you stepped away from the camera right now, but what is it called? Like a dink?
Dink, dual income, no kids.
Right. It's all the rage right now. And if you go to like the bougie PMC like coffee shops, like there will be hats that say that dual income, no kids. Dink. It's like the recipe for the good life right now. Dual income, no kids. That's kind of the prerequisite for being able to have a decent life in today's economy. Of course, that's not good if you actually want to have children or if you happen to be single. If you're single and have children, you're screwed. And then there is like this sort of like, well, then you should have had an abortion. Right? From the liberal side, it's like, well, you should have had an abortion. From the conservative side, well, you should have married a rich man. Like, you know, I'm being vulgar, but the basic point should stand. Dinks, dieting, exercising, essentializing, tiny house living dinks can have a pretty good life. Right? But of course, they've cut so many of the parts of the American dream out that mattered also for sustainability purposes, like having an actual society, children, that it's not feasible that can be kept up for long, right? But people want to have a good life. So they become dinks. And Ann and I right now are able to make ends meet doing Theory Underground and working part-time at the university. We're able to make ends meet because we are dual income, no kids. But we want children. And so that means our horizon of possibilities is looking at the current situation and going, this is not sustainable. We actually have to change our situation, right? Okay, but why do I really want to belabor the point that labor power is a commodity, the average price wage of which is going to more or less match the cost of its production, the socially necessary labor time of its production? Well, wages go up. How much over time? Ann pointed out, not very much. It doesn't track with the profits being produced, right? And that's because profits are dependent on surplus value. And surplus value is the amount of value created in a day or a week that is over and above the cost of your reproduction. So us as wage laborers, we have our cost of production, our labor power, our means of subsistence. And I'm going to go ahead and just say that this little I've drawn a rectangle, and part of it, we're going to say that this is a month instead of a week or a day. We're going to say it's a month. So in a given month, the cost of your socially necessary labor time, depending on where you live, is somewhere between $1,200 and $3,000. Okay, we'll just say that. Sorry, that was terrible handwriting. Your job, if it's full-time, is going to have to pay you enough. Now, I mean, I don't think most people can live much of a life off of $1,200 a month. That's kind of crazy at this point. But there are places in this country probably where rent would be cheap enough, or where you could live off of somebody else, or you could live in somebody's backyard or something like that. Now, it's much more likely that you need something closer to $2,000 or $3,000 a month, especially if you live in a city. So that's your socially necessary labor time to create the cost of your socially necessary labor time to create rent, food, insurance, phone, to give you enough to be able to get all those things. Okay, so how long in the week do you actually, or the month, did you actually have to work to earn this much? Okay, 3,000. We'll just go with 3,000. The point is, surplus value is the time, the extra time / labor power that you have given to capital, the extra time and labor power that you've given to capital that goes over and above what you actually needed to be able to provide yourself with your means of subsistence, what you actually needed to be able to reproduce your labor power. Now, obviously, the capitalist can't have you keep coming back to work if you don't get paid enough to be able to keep coming back to work. In this case, like with Theory Underground, I need basically $2,000 a month. In our current situation, that's how much I need. And then if I want to ever do anything with my life, I would, or like outside of what I tend to do, like if I wanted to go on a vacation, or if I wanted to buy a moped, well, I'm going to need a little bit of extra money, right? If I wasn't getting paid enough to pay for my rent, my food, my insurance, my phone, obviously I would lose those things. You would no longer see me. Bye-bye, everybody. I'd have to go figure something else out. Yeah, well, I put a lot of extra time and energy into this arrangement. I put a lot of extra time and energy into this, and it's not creating capital for me. I do not have I do not have like some big capital investment fund that is coming out of that extra time that I spend, right? I'm up here. I'm merely reproducing the cost of my labor power. I'm merely producing enough for my bare necessities currently. Now, the goal is to up it enough that I'm able to pay Mikey more so that he can actually do this eventually instead of working at his warehouse gig. So that I'm able to make it so that Ann doesn't have to work full time, so that we can actually start a family, right? We want this. But the thing is that extra is more like we want a house someday, right? So it's arguable how much of this is actually capitalist or even obeying the circuit of capital. We live in this sort of sweet, sort of petty PMC, petty bourgeois level of the economy on the edge of the bottom of the middle class, where we are able to get by without really serving the law of value in a sort of sense. Like, instead of this being a capitalist endeavor where I'm thinking about employing a lot of people and then stretching them thin by working them hard and for a long period of time and making a lot more than I'm paying them, instead of having to think about such things, I'm able to kind of just do some kind of a subscription model with you all where you pay a low monthly amount and then I don't have to work as much. I can focus on this. Well, that's kind of true with anybody at the bottom of the middle class. We can all start coffee shops or make necklaces and sell them on Etsy, or do little things, sell stuff at the farmer's market that don't really follow the laws of capital developed in Das Kapital. Yeah, well, that child mining cobalt in the Congo, that material situation obeys these laws. When we're talking about factories, they obey these laws. When we're talking about like the grunt work, the hardest work, the work that requires the most blood, sweat, and tears, the most precarity, those kinds of jobs follow these laws. But in the privileged, middle strata of the developed world, there is kind of like enough surplus money going around because people do have their coping mechanisms that they need to be able to acquire. That money ultimately funds a lot of the petty bourgeois, petty PMC kind of shit that we do. And that's ultimately what we're doing right here. That's where this money comes from. Saved wages that could have been spent on beer, wages that could have been spent on church tithes, wages that could have been spent on a few nice meals in the month. They could have been spent on a few movie nights, like dates with someone, Instead, it's going towards developing yourself intellectually, right? So I'm just trying to separate our situation and the kinds of economics that we, as part of the lower middle class, tend to kind of presuppose, trying to separate that from the global system of extraction, manufacture, production, distribution, circulation through exchange and consumption that is ultimately presupposed by our mode of life, right? You have all these people talking about the Norwegian model, right? Oh, we need to do things the way that they do things in Norway or whatever, Oh, Finland, they have it all figured out. Yeah, but that is a wealthy country that presupposes exactly what the meta-modernists don't want to look at. The meta-modernists who don't want to think about capital. The meta-modernists who don't think about Marx. The meta-modernists who think about everything as just ideas, man. There was modernity, there was post-modernity, now we're meta-modern. But what they're not looking at is the global system of extraction, manufacture, distribution that they presuppose. And for anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, the two most important texts in metamodernism are the Listening Society and the Nordic ideology. And the long and short of it is they see everything as like ideas, man. We just need better ideas. And the Nordic idea, the way that the Nordics do things, that's how we could all do things, and then we could all have a good life and poverty would be solved. But what they're not looking at is the wealth distribution that occurs at this global level thanks to the way that we presuppose the global south, not all of the global south, but specific sections of the global south doing heavy extraction and children spending their entire lives mining cobalt. Okay? But what I wanted to say about surplus value finally is like, yes, so it's this extra time and labor power. That's where the surplus value and therefore profit is going to come from for the capitalist, right? Okay, but there's two kinds of it in this book, Das Kapital. There is absolute versus relative, and that's what I'll close out on. And basically, absolute has to do with the time of the day, or the length, I'll say length of day / week / month versus the intensity of the labor. How much you actually create, how much value you actually create in that amount of time. Okay, now it's absolute because there are absolute limits on the length of the day, the length of the week, the length of the month, right? There are absolute limits. There are 24 hours in a day, and you need a certain amount of sleep. So there are absolute limits on how much you can actually work within a day. And that's, so basically during a profitability crisis, the capitalist, and we'll just go with a capitalist in the Congo to make things simpler so that we're not confusing ourselves, getting all like, oh, we're in the middle class, so it doesn't work this way. No, but in the Congo, the point is during a profitability crisis, the point is you tell people, sorry, instead of 12 hours per day, 6 days a week, you're going to be working 14 hours per day, 6 days a week. Or, sorry, I know 5 days a week has been the norm, but we're actually going to move to 6 days a week. Or they'll develop some kind of a swing shift model where you're actually working more than 6 days a week if you actually step back, zoom out, and look at it. Well, you're getting paid close to the same amount, but you're working way longer. So, of course, that creates way more surplus value and therefore profit that these capitalists are able to invest towards research and development, which is all going towards means of production being more efficient. Not more efficient so that we can all have more time in our lives, for our families, for our talents, for our purposes, for our higher callings. No, but specifically so that more and more workers can be replaced by more and more efficient machines. And then that gets us to the relative surplus value. Relative surplus value being the intensity of the labor being done. How hard you're working. And of course, you can only work so hard. So work smarter, not harder. From the standpoint of capital, what that means is make smarter machines and dumber workers, right? In Wage, Labor, and Capital, very important point that came up, but I'll reemphasize it, is that when research and development is all, I don't think you can see that on this. So when research and development is all going towards the re-rationalization and making more efficient and productive the means of production, we could say that we get machinic genius versus worker genius. And what Marx said is that with the increase of machinic genius, you have the inverse for the worker. What's the opposite of genius? Stupidity, drudgery. He says cretinism. Okay. Well, there's a fun little caveat, and that is if the work is dumb enough that you can sneak an earbud in to work, we are possible. We become possible. Workers with earbuds who are able to study these things by disassociating from the mundane labor and taking on intellectual challenges we are able to immerse ourselves in these fields of the life of the mind: sociology, anthropology, history, political economy, critical theory. We are able to immerse ourselves in philosophy, and we're able to do that, and the PMC's not. The people who are the traditional gatekeepers of these fields have lowered their standards because they are being stretched thin and overworked and underpaid. But we find ourselves in this sweet spot where we're able to research these things and not do it for profit. We're able to research these things and not have our research and development serve the ever sophistication of the means of production, the re-rationalization of the economy. Potentially. Though, of course, as with all open source kind of innovative things that have ever happened on the internet, they have been appropriated and served and made to serve capital, right? So there's this interesting question of what we are able to do, because we find ourselves in this place where, yeah, we are all made dumber and dumber and dumber, all of us. Yeah, but some of us are actually able to put an earbud in and listen to you or something like it. That's historically new. It's never happened before. It was not going on during Marx's time. It was not going on at the dawn of Taylorism. It was not going on during the 1960s student uprisings. It was not going on even in the 90s. We're in a new era. There's new possibilities before us, and they're not exactly ones that were foreseen. So although there have been changes in the situation as analyzed and critiqued by Marx, some of those changes are not purely negative. Some of them bring real opportunities and possibilities for us. Opportunities and possibilities for us to do something different. And part of that something different that matters is the development, not just of a vision of the world and of the good life, a vision of the horizon of possibilities that will render obviously unsatisfying the current relations of production and mode of production, but also the development of institutions themselves, new institutions. New institutions, and I'm going to go ahead and just right here, institutions, the word, I'm going to take the first T, uppercase it, and add a 3 by that. Anybody who's been around knows that stands for the triple T, 3 T's: time, energy, talent, and tutelage. What we need are institutions that are time energetic, not just freeing people up of their time and energy, but also of giving them real ways forward on their horizon of possibilities to direct that time and that energy in a meaningful way with other people, to be able to help, and I'll say it for the last time in close, to help us explore, discover, and cultivate. Explore, discover, and cultivate our talents and relationships. Thank you. And then we're going to take a second here to, I'm curious what kind of thoughts that has stirred up for any of you. I'm curious if anyone has any questions. We'll spend another 15 minutes here. What you're about to hear is the sort of community side of this research seminar. You're going to hear from Ian and Nance and Tyler, and we've got a bunch of people here at Theory Underground who come for these events, who get really involved, who are doing their own sort of research projects, who are writing things that are potentially going to get published at Theory Underground or elsewhere, as well as people who are just sort of taking inspiration from all of this, and it feeds their creative endeavors. If you want to join that community, if you want to be a part of the ongoing live side of these things, and if you want to get access to so much of the stuff that is not currently public on either the podcast or on the YouTube channel, stick around until the end of this video to see a little bit more of how to get involved. You want to sign up for the Snellgrove McKerracher Research Seminar. Yeah, because that will also unlock the Capital Seminar. But if you don't want to stick around till the end, to see that. If you're just in such a hurry to do it right now, just look in the description down below. You'll find the link. Click it. And there are tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. At tier 4, you also get access to the Mikey seminar. At tier 2, you get access to basically everything. Tier 3 comes with some extra time and energy on our part, especially on the writing workshop side of things. But ultimately, we're trying to make this affordable for regular working people. Workers with earbuds, unite.
I what I was thinking with the new possibilities is what you've been talking about controlling the background and how like having an earbud allows for you to do that. And I think that is something, yeah, what you were saying, like something new, right? And then tying it to yesterday's class with Nike, that how concepts actually change behaviors. I do see a possibility in which enough people with earbuds have the exposure through different like concepts, and they can slowly and gradually like steer the underground. And like I feel like that kind of change wouldn't be like a massive flare or something. Like it will just like it will be like a slow burn. Like people just are like, oh, I'm not gonna do that shit anymore, or become aware of your situation through that exposure of the earbud. And I think that is a more gradual, long-lasting change than just getting like sign up for the revolution and like kill something, right?
Yeah, it gives us the possibility for new kinds of social change and new models of what social change can be. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of just tack on to what you're saying also, this standard way of thinking from the Marxist standpoint is the mode of production is what matters the most. And if anybody remembers that lecture I gave in Anne's class, I talked about the 3 R's, which I have had up here on this whiteboard the whole time. Representation, recognition, and redistribution. These are always the 3 kinds of change that can be made by the PMC, and therefore they're the only kinds of change that get prioritized because all social change comes from the PMC. And so representation, recognition, and redistribution, though sometimes they get at a point and there's something there, those exhaust the possibilities for social change today because that's where student activists go, into the institutions. And the way they think is like, if we could just have more black people on the boards of these businesses or in the halls of government. Or, if we could just have black Ariel so that the little kid feels recognized. Or if we could just have, and remember, I use these examples specifically because I was using race as the example, like a black UBI in Oakland, which happened in 2020. It's not a UBI if it's only for black people. That would be a PBI, particular basic income, or a particularist basic income. But the basic point being, Kamala, black Ariel, and PBI in Oakland. Those are 3 examples of representation, recognition, and redistribution, right? Versus the mode of production. How do we actually change the mode of production so the overwhelming majority of people are not working themselves to death to valorize surplus value? How do we actually change the mode of production so that Belizean sugarcane farmers don't just have to be Belizean sugarcane farmers, but can have real possibilities on their horizon? How do we change that, right? Well, and of course, the standard Marxist argument is going to be, the workers need to organize. The workers need to take over the government and the military. The workers need to combat the law of value and change the commodification of everything and force some kind of a new system that doesn't just give them representation and recognition and redistribution, but would actually, and this would be good Marxism, change the mode of production itself at the fundamental level. And I agree with that insofar as I care about large-scale structural change. But the question is, with McLuhan and Baudrillard and the inversion of base and superstructure, insofar as there's a point to that, and even though it's not the whole picture, it's not completely true, the question is, at the level of the relations of production and the horizon of possibilities, Are there things that we can do, workers with earbuds, that render more untenable this old system, this old division of labor, that render untenable that, and at the same time help create new institutions, and also with those visions of what's possible and also relations of production that will then force changes at the level of the mode of production. And I'm putting that as a question because there's so many different ways that could go. And that could be a new Marxism, but that could also be a good kind of post-Marxism. But ultimately, the one thing that we'll all agree on is that for it to matter in the long run, it has to be large-scale structural change. It's not going to be sufficient for it to be our little commune. And also, communes don't work anyway because one or two people make everything happen, and they have all the responsibility and all the power, even if they try to redistribute it, because people don't have the time energy. They just do not have the time energy to do things cooperatively outside of the system of labor power where they're already working cooperatively way too much in a sort of sense. Anyway, so I'm glad you brought that up, though, because I forgot to even touch on what was on the whiteboard this whole time. And that's what I wanted to make sure to address. So thank you. Anybody else?
Swole and or Liz in the chat here said, why is capital so different from ancient slavery or feudalism? And I think that's an interesting question. I think we could talk for hours and days about that. But why is capital so different from ancient slavery or feudalism? I don't know. I think that's a good question.
Yeah, and that's something worth developing. But the short version is that the wealth being produced in ancient Egypt or by a serf in the old feudal situation, that was wealth that was ultimately going towards the parties of feudal lords or towards the building of a new temple or of a pyramid. But ultimately, the pyramid or the temple is something that serves everybody, ostensibly. So that is to say that the wealth, aka the surplus, was going towards the collectivity. And today the surplus is going towards the refining via research and development of the means of production so that people can diversify their private investment portfolios. And that's all that matters, right? That's all that matters, right? That would be my short answer. I don't know if you have anything you would like to add to that, Swole. Definitely curious to hear what you were thinking of.
Yeah, more along the lines of like, you could argue some kind of profit is being extracted in ancient Greece and Rome and in Egypt and in feudalism in different ways. But, why is it that these societies never took off like the idea of like, reselling and reinvesting the surplus that the ruling class made? And what was different about capitalism that took off? Like why were aristocrats just cool with taking in the low amount of profit and just keeping that and not potentially getting richer when maybe that possibility was on the table?
Well, I think part of it is science and technology reaching a qualitatively different level where the merchant class could then overpower the aristocratic class. And that's why the bourgeoisie wins its revolutions against. But I want to hear, Swole, did you have an idea though? Like as far as like your own, are you just posing the question or do you have your own idea as an answer?
I kind of have in it like a stock answer, but I'm curious to what you guys have to say.
Nance or anybody else have anything that they'd add to my answer, which is just a provisional one for now?
I think specifically that the surplus becomes like a side effect of the process itself. Like it's not just that the profit is being collected in a small amount of people, or it's being reinvested, but it's like, yeah, it's the machine itself. Like it becomes this churn, where that surplus used to benefit the community. It used to be a universal like resource. It becomes like the blood of the machine itself. I think that's the main difference. And the point that it's because we killed God and the bourgeois kind of emerged as this class that wasn't beholden to the church nor the state. Yeah, I think it was all just kind of good timing. And the machinery was in place. Luke says,
Yeah,
but was the profit really for the community? That's a good question too. Of course it wasn't, but yeah. Anyways, well,
I think what you're saying is actually a big piece of it. But I would say, I mean, the stock answer from learning as a Trotskyist would be that the Black Death in Europe, or the Black Plague, and the collapse of the feudal order and the rise of merchants and bankers, and the movement from, the enclosures, like that was a big part, right? Like kicking people off the land and into the cities, and all of a sudden, you get and the wealth extracted from the New World. So all these things combine to make the conditions for surplus value and capitalist accumulation kind of make a lot more sense, I think. Yeah, and you've got all these people kicked off the land suddenly in the cities looking for work, and now you've got a base for capital accumulation that you didn't have before. Everybody was on the living on the land previously, subsistence farming, and then they're like, why would we go work for somebody else? And now suddenly that situation changed.
Yeah, I added here on the whiteboard, while Nance was talking, I put God up and then crossed out God and then put the greater sign over pointing towards MCM prime and the almighty dollar. Obviously, like this shift where God is not the center of gravity that justifies the feudal order and the sort of center of gravity that the church held in maintaining these relations. That's a crucial part of it. And obviously from a very conservative sort of traditionalist critique of capital, like the sort of capitalist critique from the sort of traditionalist standpoint, it's actually like, no, yeah, the death of God is the cause of capitalism. The other way of talking about it is, no, capitalism is the cause of the death of God. But the enclosure, the closure of the commons, closing off the commons, that was a big part of it. Like land was shared in common between the peasants and the serfs, or that land was technically owned by the church and or the feudal lord. But people all they had to do was pay a corvée to the feudal lord, pay a tithe to the church, and then they got to kind of live on that land and do their thing, right? And the closure of the commons, that comes from a struggle that lasted hundreds of years between the new rising bourgeoisie and the old aristocracy. And so those were like laws that were passed, right? Those were laws that were passed. That was an actual like legal battle. We'll get into that in Capital Volume 1. But the most important point there is that creation of a mass of dispossessed workers, right? It just used to be that, well, we live on this land. This is where we're from. This is where we've always been. And we pay a corvée to the feudal lord and we pay a tithe to the church, and this is where we live. This is fine. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't have anything except for the labor power that I can sell. And now I live in London and my life is shit. I guess they would say shite, but there you go. Anyway, with that, thanks. That was great, Eamon. And then what do you got, David?
Actually, I'll add something quick onto the end of what you were just saying. In monasteries, under, I think, from the effect of Aristotle, they started rationalizing their production, and that actually might be a major stream that fed into capitalism. There's early like labor disputes where there's two classes of monks, like commoners and aristocrats, and there are like basically strikes by the commoner monks because they were like being overworked, but they were like getting surpluses early on. Then the other thing is Venice might have been the first sort of political like and social organization based on the MCM circuit, because they were sending out ships of investors, and like even if you were like a lowly person, you could like invest a little bit in the merchant trip, and that ended up they loaned all the money for the Fourth Crusade, and when they were afraid they weren't going to get their money back, they had the Crusaders sack Constantinople, and all that wealth came back into Europe. So anyway, there's some weird stuff that probably fed into it. But my big question is like, I wonder, there's some certain specific things that are sort of like maybe they're in Marx, but they're very under theorized because they weren't important at the time. And I wonder like how it would change our account of capital. So specifically like energy and how what effect oil had on the growth of capitalism. And then we have the MCM circuit, but like what does it mean with digital technology when everything is transformed into bits, and I can be like, you made money when I pressed a button here. Like the computers did a bunch of stuff and some money was made somewhere somehow, like through just the machines talking or whatever. At what point is enough of that going on that it would like change the account, that we need to say something um different or new about it, I guess. And you know, I think the other thing that's obvious now is we rely for the natural world, the environment, so to speak, for a bunch of like services, like producing air that we can breathe, uh, water, soil, etc., that are just sort of like taken for granted. Uh, does it need to change how we think about things now that we realize, oh, we might have fucked up something by not realizing that they're not just free gifts that nature gave us or whatever.
Yeah, that's really important. And also, I think part of that is like we don't look at the soil as sacred. We don't look at nature as sacred. And part of the modern scientific project and its vision, going hand in hand with like a new sort of phase of patriarchy, really was about like treating nature like a woman that you are subjugating, and that there. I mean, Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, but even Machiavelli. If you just look at the way that they talk about nature and chance and the need for a sort of control over chance and nature, it's not just gendered language. No, it's like it's literally like we're going to make ourselves masters and possessors, and treat it like a bitch, right? And like that approach is not a coincidence, according to someone like Vandana Shiva, who we'll get into eventually, in this research. That's a change in the mode of production. That's a change in the mode of exchange. That's a change in our horizon of possibilities. That's a change in how we conceive of ourselves and of the world and of nature. And it's not just ideas that are just downstream from technological innovations. Those technological innovations wouldn't have necessarily become what they were if not for a certain worldview and approach towards nature. And so, but also the question about at what point does finance, capital, and the gig economy and the platform capitalism and the digital kind of currency. When at what point do all of these things compile and we're talking about a whole new animal? Is absolutely essential, right? It's an essential question. So yeah. All right, we're going to close out in a second here. Anyone else have something else? Any other burning question or contribution that they wanted to raise? Tyler?
I just was so earlier you were talking about wanting to talk with friends, family, share some of these arguments and concepts without having them write you off right away. And I guess I'm really interested in that as well. Obviously, like, I still feel like I don't really understand Marxism enough and the different arguments to do that well. But I do want to just share like a quick story of, I was out having drinks with my mom and my stepdad maybe a couple months ago, and we're talking about my parents, their businesses and the struggles of everything. And there's a part of me that thinks that they they're too ethical to ever be really successful capitalists, because they're not necessarily willing to just exploit their workers for every little ounce of surplus value that they can get. And somehow I kind of explained, like, the way I kind of think of this is, like, I think of you guys, Mom and Kevin, I think of you guys, and then I think of you alongside some of my other friends that say own like roofing and siding businesses that maybe go out and are employing migrant labor, and say that they buy the labor power, the commodity of one of these workers for $30 an hour, and then they turn around and sell that for $60, and then you do that 5 times over for a crew of 5 guys, and then a crew, and then say five crews. So now whoever that business owner is making 25 times whatever one of the workers is. And just explaining it that way to my stepdad, he was like, well, that's unethical. And I don't know, I just wanted to share that as like, yeah, like but also, I mean, to throw that out there is like, is that a sound argument to make? I don't know, any critique of kind of the way that I presented that? Is it hope-filled to hear kind of that as a testimony of like, no, people who think that they hate Marx actually on some degree implicitly agree with them, even though they don't know it. That's all.
That's a really good example, by the way. I mean, is it hopeful? I think so, right? I think so. But is it, I guess my concern is that just to cover insurance and legal fees and to cover the cost of the deterioration of the vehicles and everything requires a lot more than what you can. So you can't pay them sort of that value that they created in that moment, because there is sort of this need to cover those costs, but there's this wiggle room, there's this gray area where there's this big question mark. And so it's easy for, I think, for someone like that to see how a lot of that is still necessary, but at the same time, like, it's not a way it's not a way for us to all live our lives. It's not a way for a whole society. Like, just going back to like the means of subsistence, all of these things, rent, food, insurance, phone, and then any of our coping mechanisms, those are all variable. Those are all changing. The cost of their production is always changing. This is why inflation matters, right? And so, I think that as far as like, and I like the way you're doing it, Tyler, finding a way of talking about these things, in a very common sense way. That is probably one of the best examples possible. My example of the weaver is too old. Nobody is sitting here relating to being a weaver. Nobody knows a weaver. Weaver's a weird word even, right? And so, no, like the migrant, construction worker is a much more relatable example. And the moral or ethical intuitions that you can play off of in a conversation like that are super powerful. And so absolutely, I think that that's a great way forward. And the bigger point then is, well, can that contractor do it fairly? Is the system in such a way that there's even like really much wiggle room for that contractor to do something more fair? And in a sort of sense, I think we have to argue probably not. Like that to put it on that contractor. I mean, obviously there might be a super unethical contractor, but they're all competing with one another, right? And you've got if you lower your value, your price tag a little bit more, you're going to get replaced by the guy who's on Craigslist who doesn't have any insurance and is not following any OSHA approved anything, and the workers are super precarious. So it's like it's a rat's nest in terms of ethics, and what we need are ways forward that render redundant or irrelevant entire sectors of the industry or industries, while at the same time taking what is genuinely necessary labor in any foreseeable future and to the best of our ability, figuring out what would be the cost of the production that could provide a dignified life. And then that has to be enforced at a larger scale structural level. Absolutely. And so it's, to me, that sounds statist, and I'm not sure if there's an alternative that's not. When we're talking about large scale structural sort of regulations, protections, etc. Could there be a state that's not owned by capital, though? Is that even possible? That's another question. So, but with that, we're going to close this out unless, I'm going to close this out. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Looking forward to diving into all of this stuff that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Peace.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory. You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Žižek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button. Subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McKerrachers are doing, then the best way is to become a tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, tier 4 is amazing because it gives you tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
And finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff. So big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people, Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons, and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my god, it's just so awkward. Thank you, patrons. Okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons, thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side, as well as the paying subscribers over at Substack. Why can't we do this? Fuck. You guys,
Please.
just thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making this bullshit possible. Thank you to the subscribers. You do it. You did so good. Thanks, guys.